I'm going to attempt to convey a rule of thumb, sort of some intuition that I've been developing on how to compare motor sizes to one another. Now, a big disclaimer right up front. This is purely based on my personal flight experience and discussing things with Ryan Harrell. If you don't know who Ryan Harrell is, he's the guy that runs Mini Quad Test Bench. He's the one that does all of those tests himself. He writes incredible articles, very technical articles about motors on his website, Mini Quad Test Bench. He is an absolute gem in our community, and I consider him the absolute authority on mini quad motors because he has more experience testing them than anybody else I know. And my only goal here is to just share my crazy ideas and get discussion stimulated, get people thinking about things other than what they normally think about, give you some brain food. So here we go. I'm going to focus on some of the most popular sizes, which are the 5-inch motors in 2205, 2207, 2306, 2405, maybe some 2208. And so let's get down into it. So what is motor width? Motor width is the diameter of the stator. And so 22 has been traditionally the stator size that we usually go with for 5-inch, but 23 and 24 and 25 and 26 have come into the scene now, and people are testing them, and some like them, some don't like them. But what is it actually doing in terms of flight feel? What I found is that the motor width defines where the peak power is in the throttle curve. And so let's put 22XX on the map right there, the 22 whatever stator size, and then 23 whatever stator size, and 24 whatever stator size. As you can see, the wider you go, the lower the peak power moves. And not a little bit. Again, this is based on just 5-inch. We will discuss the rest later, but just 5-inch for now. But the wider you go, the lower the peak power is. Now, what does stator height do? Stator height can widen the power band. So let's put 2205 on the map. And this is arbitrarily positioned based on my experience of flying the 2205 stator, 22XX stator sizes. And now let's put 2207 on top of it. As you can see, the 2207 has a much wider power band. You have more fidelity of control throughout the throttle range with a 2207 than you do with a 2205. Now, kV and volts, those are a little bit funny. And so let's just focus on stator width and stator height. So the two motors that first got me thinking about this stuff and really just sparked that intuition that I started to form was when the Hyperlight 2307 was made. When we made that motor, it is essentially identical to the old Hyperlight 2207, which is pretty much the same as the current Hyperlight 2207, yet it's 1 millimeter wider. And people were ordering these motors a dozen at a time. And people that I respect, trust, and talk to all the time and fly with regularly were saying, oh, it's slower than the 2207. But the KVs are the same. Everything is essentially the same. Put it on the same battery. It's essentially the same motor. It's just 1 millimeter wider. How could it be slower? That doesn't make sense. And when I personally flew it myself, I felt the same thing. I'm like, how can I dislike this motor so much? It's the same motor. It's a 2307. It should just be a little bit better. Yeah, it's a gram heavier too, but it should essentially be better. Why do I like the 2207 more? So that's the first time I realized that going 1 millimeter wider actually shifts that entire power band down the throttle range quite a bit. Not just a little bit, a really good bit. And so the stator width really strongly governs where that peak power band is. And you have to add a lot more height in order to compensate and pull that power band out. So once I actually figured that out, then it was very easy for me to explain why the 2405, the Hyperlight 2405 motor, just didn't perform the way I wanted it to. Why I hated that motor. When I first flew that motor, I flew it for exactly 2 packs. I took them back to Sergio and I said, these are the worst motors I've ever flown. And that motor went on to be the most popular motor the most popular Hyperlight motor ever made. And so now I kind of understand why that might be. So let me explain my personal flying style. I fly acro. I don't race at all. And when I fly acro, I don't fly in the top 30% of my throttle range. I am almost always in the lower 70, 80% of my throttle range. In fact, I'm so much so in the lower 70-80% of my throttle range, I often cut the top 10% off. I really only use maximum throttle to really give me that last kick in the butt when I'm trying to like punch over a tree or something, when I'm racing up to get over the tree. I don't use it. I almost never use it. Even when I'm going fast down low, I almost never use it. When I'm going through trees, obviously, I'm not going super quick. So I'm working in the lower throttle range. So I need to have a really nice, meaty, yet accurate, yet wide throttle control range in the lower 50%-ish of my quad. If you look at the 2207 motor, that's pretty much exactly what it is. It's got a really soft throttle onset down in the bottom 50-60%. And then once you get to that 60-70% or 65-70-ish percent, you get that maximum peak power, and then it starts to taper off, but you still have some power going up the throttle. So that's why it feels so great to me and why I really love the 2207 stator size. When you compare that to the 2405, it's got a big hump of power down low, and then it just tapers, and it does exactly the opposite of what I want. That's why I hated it so much. At least that's my best explanation. And so it had zero punch when I was trying to get over a tree. It didn't do it at all. It got the prop spinning real quick, but real down low, but it didn't give me what I wanted when I wanted to move and get over stuff. But if you think about this for racing, they're usually on the gas all the time, and they're racing in the top 40%, not in the bottom 40% like I flying acro. So it makes sense that racers really like the 2405. And again, this is outside efficiency, this is outside speed, this is outside power, outside thrust. None of that stuff is part of this discussion. It's purely flight feel. And I've talked to a lot of racers, and they say the flight feel of the 2405 is actually very good for them, and they like it over the 2207, which to me sounds preposterous because I hate the 2405, but that's because I don't race. So let's now compare 2207 to 2306. Well, it's a lot of the same thing. The 23 stator width moves the throttle peak, the peak power, so far down that when I'm trying to fly low or just through trees or trying to get really fine control in that lower half of my throttle range, I'm like pounding on this peak power portion of my throttle range, and it's like very poppy, and I can't really get a really good grip on it. And on top of that, if I am going through branches and trees in my proximity flying, which is what I love to do, and I need to like blip over a branch, or I need to blip to get over something, I don't have the immediacy of power when I go up on the throttle range because it tapers off as it goes up. It doesn't give me that pop when it goes up in the throttle range. I've already passed that pop of power. So that's the reason why I prefer 2207 over 2306. At least, again, this is my best explanation for flight feel. Again, this is only based on flight feel, only based on my experience. That is all, only trying to stimulate discussion. None of this is completely accurate. I have no scientific backing for any of this. So now let's expand this discussion to props. We haven't touched kV or voltage yet at all. Let's expand this discussion to props. So the props that we use for mini quads are all relatively low pitch, and we do have some very high pitch, what we consider high pitch, which is 5 pitch, 5.1, 5.2 pitch, which we don't even know if it's actually 5.1 or 5.2, but they say it is, and it looks steeper. And the actual reason why we don't really use super steep pitch props, because planes sometimes have pitches of like 20, we don't use those kinds of props because we're flying in a mostly hover state. Even when we're going fast, it's still kind of sort of a hover state. We still have to do, upward thrust vector to stay up in the air. So it's partial hover state. And having a super steep pitch prop, it stalls in the air. You have to get that prop spinning fast before it actually starts acting in the air. So the low pitch props actually give us better performance down low and throughout our throttle range because we don't have a prop that's stalling in the air. But the low pitch props are relatively slow. We want to go faster. So now all these new props that are coming out are all really amazingly engineered, and they actually have a very dynamic blade, and they can go fast, they can go slow. Some are high amp, some are low amp, whatever it is. Generally, low pitch props are what we use. And so when you think about the motors and where the peak throttle power is, well, it's not all that difficult to get a relatively low pitch prop spinning. It is difficult to get it to spin faster and faster and faster at the top end. So what's the value of having a super wide motor for the quote unquote torque that people always say they prefer? And I'll get to torque in a second. It doesn't make total sense to me to go with a 24 size width or a 25 size width for a 5-inch prop, because it's not all that difficult to get that thing spinning. So in reality, the ability of the motor to hit its peak power lower in the throttle range might actually be wasted because the prop doesn't need a lot of power to get it spinning. But the opposite is kind of also true. If you go with too narrow of a motor, then you do lose the ability to get that prop up to the actual active range. And so an example of this would be something like trying to run a 5-inch prop on a 1407 or a 14 side width motor. The experience that I had with that was that it was so unable to get the prop up to speed that I had to increase my minimum RPM up to like 9-10% just to get the motor to never drop below the RPM at which it struggles to push the prop up to speed. It's not difficult to spin the prop up to speed. It's just physically trying to overcome the weight and the drag of the prop to get it in the range where the motor actually has power to manage the prop transition times and the ability to just give you good control. Additionally, as you drop the stator width, you're pushing that peak power higher and higher and higher on the total throttle curve. And so giving it more stator height with a narrower width means that you can try to expand that power band, but you're going to hit the max limit at the 100% point. Like you can give it kV, which we haven't discussed yet, kV to give you more total range of performance, but you're going to hit that cap point where you sacrifice the rest of the potential throttle resolution that you could have. You kind of you run up to your max peak power and then it stops and it's done. So I already said what kV can do. kV will expand the motor's power range. The range of performance that you can get out of the motor is what the kV will expand. But there's a limit. You can't have a motor that's too low kV and you can't have a motor that's too high kV. There's a pretty broad kV sweet spot that the motor will actually work well in. But let's go back to the fundamentals of motor height and motor width. We said that the motor width governs where the peak power on the throttle range is. If you have a 2405 motor with the peak power way down low and you give it more and more and more and more kV, what does kV do? kV is just going to get the motor to spin faster and faster and faster. And so we already know that the power of this motor tapers off drastically as you get up into the throttle range, so much so that the top 20% of the throttle range pretty much does nothing. And that's where all that kV is. You're giving it all of that potential RPM zone that you cannot access because the motor doesn't have the power to push it up there. So there's no point in running a 3000 kV 2405 motor. And just in case somebody is doing that, this is just my view, my opinion based on my experience. Please don't think I'm just trying to push my ideas onto you. I'm just trying to stimulate thoughts and discussion. But on the flip side, let's say you have a 2210, which has a lot of stator height and it has a much higher peak power point on the throttle range, and you give it more and more and more kV. Well, we know that the motor can actually spin up into the higher throttle range and still have power to push to higher RPMs. But there is still a limit, because the kV will eventually get to that point of the motor throttle range where it doesn't have any more power. It can't keep reaching higher and higher and higher kV. You have reached the maximum potential of the motor. And so if you go way beyond, then you're just killing your throttle resolution and there's no point to all that extra kV. This is the balancing act that motor companies must do. And I have talked to ZMX about this, and they've talked to me about this a lot. And they've sent me some experimental motors, the 2207 3000 kV that they make, which they calculated was that balance point where you get the maximum potential out of the motor. You get the maximum flight feel, maximum potential of throttle range. You get everything out of the motor. So whereas we usually think about high kV like, oh my God, it's an amp hog and it's crazy, which it might be because it's trying to suck more. You're basically just oversaturating the motor stator and trying to get it to push up faster and faster, which is just drawing amps unnecessarily because the motor can't actually go faster, but it's just drawing those amps to try and try and try as much as it can. But in reality, what is high kV? There's no such thing. It's just the right kV for the motor, or too high for the motor. kV should be very closely matched with the motor construction, the motor design, the magnets, the stator, all of that should be very carefully tuned to what the optimal kV is for that motor. So there's another thing I said, the magnets, the stator, the way they're made. So let's real quick discuss just the construction of the motor and how it impacts the flight feel of the motor. So I've been testing old motors. I recently tested the Emax MT2208 from 3+ years ago, and it's a motor that has weak magnets, wide air gap, square magnets. The laminations are big. Everything is just not optimal at all. But hey, it flies pretty darn well. On top of that, it's 1500 kV, and I'm running 5-inch props and 6S on this motor. I'm running 1400 kV on my 7-inch motor, 7-inch quad, and it's awesome. So how is only 100 kV more going to be suitable for 5-inch? Doesn't totally make sense. And hey, it's not actually that slow. So the equivalent kV in 4S for this motor is actually 2200 kV, and for 5-inch, 2200 kV is okay. It's not fast. It's okay, but it's not fast. But it's a 2208 stator. And here's where I'll tell you that the stator size is pretty much king to me. You can have a really junky 2208 and compare it against a really, really good 2206, the best 2206, and the 2208 will feel better and it'll probably have more power and it'll do everything better, aside from the motor weight. Forget the motor weight. But it'll do pretty much everything better. And I've actually compared that directly side by side. So I know that stator size is actually more meaningful than the actual construction of the motor. For the most part. Not always, of course, but for the most part. A good example of this is the RCIN Power 1108 versus the Hawksky 1107. I've recently tested these two quads, and the RCN Power 1108 has weak magnets, wide air gap, square magnets, not the best construction, and it has a lot of power, and it has really good throttle feel across the range. The 1107 from Hawksky has the best magnets, curved magnets, the tightest air gap, the thinnest laminations. It's really a stellar construction motor, but I can definitely feel that it has a narrower power band. And so I think that is the best example I have for what the best magnets, the best air gap, the best everything does to the motor. Forget the laminations for a moment, because that's primarily focused on efficiency, but the strong magnets, thin air gap, the curved magnets so you can get them closer to the stator, that stuff actually helps expand the power band even further. Usually not as much as adding an extra millimeter of height, but it does help quite a bit to expand that power band. They give the motor the ability to work more effectively in the areas where it's not at peak performance or peak power. Usually not as much as adding an extra millimeter of height, but it does help quite a bit to expand that power band. But as I've said in the past, 2.5-inch quads and these tiny little motors, they exhibit these features a lot more than the 22 5-inch, 6-inch size motors. This idea or term or concept of torque that people constantly talk about so much, say, oh, this motor is really torquey, that motor is really not torquey. Well, that also doesn't make total sense. That's very elusive to me, what that means. What is torque? I don't fully get how torque plays into a prop that's spinning faster and faster, and how, I mean, it's not a car engine where you need to get the wheels spinning down low. Like I said, we're running props that are relatively easy to get spinning up to speed. And on top of that, how do you know how much torque, quote unquote, you need to get the prop spinning into the effective range where you want to actually get the power from the prop and the thrust and the motor spinning and all that stuff? Is a 24 stator width enough, quote unquote, torque? Is a 20 stator? Like, how do you know this? You really only know it by testing. But people buy motors based on, oh, I want that low end power, so I want that 24. But is that the right choice? I don't know. So now let's discuss different prop sizes. And I'm really just going to discuss going up in prop size because I've tested big motors more than I've tested small motors. I've tested a lot of motors, but small and big, but primarily the bigger ones are easier to kind of feel these differences in. As you go up in prop size, you generally don't need as much RPM, generally. So it might make more sense to use a motor that has a lower peak power zone. So it kind of sort of starts to make sense to use wider motors as you go up in prop size, in terms of my intuition, as you go up in prop size. But you also have to drop the kV because, as we discussed before, adding too much kV to the motor just is a waste. You're just wasting that top end where the motor doesn't have the power to spin the prop up to speed because it can't. On the same note, I would say this discussion doesn't really explain the right motor size choice for the given prop. And that's because I actually still prefer the 22 size stator even on a 7-inch prop. I don't like the 24s or the 25s, and I have tested them. The 22 size with a tall height, 10 millimeter height is what I would recommend, not the 12 millimeter height of the Sunny Sky that I have, because it just feels like it might be just a little too much. I haven't actually tested a 2210 on 7-inch yet, but if you have that height, you have a really wide power band, so it'll actually, and it's a big motor, it's a big stator too, so it can actually generate a lot of power, so it'll actually pull that whole power band down low to get the prop spinning up to speed. Plus we're using low pitch props, so they're relatively easy to spin to get up to speed. So I don't know, it's really a preference thing. You really have to test it. But for me, I like where the 22 width peak power performance is. I like where it is on the throttle. I feel like it makes it really easy to fly, really nice performance, really good to like cruise, and really nice to just pop the gas. And this is kind of why I've honed in on the 22 millimeter size. I've tried all the sizes, 18, 20, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, and all of them feel different to me, surprisingly. I don't know how they feel different, but they actually do feel different. And the 22 stator size just feels correct to me for how I modulate the throttle myself. What adds more power, stator height or stator width? Well, if you compare a 2405 to a 2207, the 2207 actually has like 15-16% more stator volume than the 2405. This didn't totally make sense to me until Corey Ibanez, MUO FPV. He explained it to me in percentages. He said, well, going from a 6 stator height to a 7 stator height is a much bigger percentage increase than going from a 24 stator width to a 25 stator width, or 23 stator width to a 24 stator width. So like 1 over 23 is smaller than 1 over 6, which is obvious. But it totally makes sense to me now, which why, 2207 just has more power than a 2405. It just has the ability to give you more power, and it also draws more amps because you have more power. But for a given prop size, as you go wider or as you go taller, you start tapering off the maximum effect you get from adding millimeters to either direction. So what is that sweet spot for a 5-inch prop, which is the most popular prop? Where does it start to taper off? Where does it stop mattering? And so I've been testing larger and larger stator sizes, and I'm comparing 2208s to 2207s because I like having meat across my throttle range. I don't want the peak performance down low. I don't want it to be super duper high either, but I like having a really meaty, I want every notch on my throttle stick to do something. I want it to all be active all the time. And so once this intuition of mine kind of clicked like a couple months ago or 2-3 months ago, then I thought, oh my gosh, I need to start testing the 2208 because that'll give me more expansion of my power band. And that's exactly what it did. And that's why this Emax MT2208, which is from yesteryear, is so good for proximity. And I haven't said this yet, but that quad I have is better at proximity than any quad I've flown. I am more confident going through trees, maintaining my altitude than I've ever been on any quad. That's the first 2208 I've flown on a 5-inch. I haven't flown a 2208 on a 5-inch. And lastly, let's discuss voltage. And I'm not talking about the same kV, like 2500 kV, and just adding 5S, 6S, 7S, 8S, 10S, whatever. I'm talking about equivalent kV with higher voltage. So what's the advantage of running 6S and low kV? Well, we already know the advantage for racing, and for freestyle, I would say there pretty much is no advantage, which I'll get to in a second. But I would say it's more of a battery advantage, not so much the quad advantage. I don't feel any added torque, which is what people say they feel when they go up in voltage, because I don't think it actually adds any torque. And Ryan actually said it doesn't, and sometimes it actually reduces the torque because you're running lower current. And by his calculations, current is actually associated with torque, not voltage. Or voltage is, but indirectly, not directly. So it's curious that people say, oh, high voltage has more torque, which it does not. What it does have is a battery advantage. You have a battery that has so many volts that if you drop a couple volts, you're not going to notice it. But if you drop a couple volts on 14 volts, you're going to notice it. So you get less sag on 6S all the time, from motor response to from battery response to dish out the power to the motors, to every last drop of the battery, where you haven't been overstressing the battery, sucking the amps down like crazy. And so you have this battery chemistry advantage. For acro or freestyle, I actually don't see that much benefit for high voltage, low kV. Yeah, you do have this advantage of not having sag, but at the same time, we usually run smaller batteries for acro. So a 1000 milliamp 6S battery is about equivalent to a 1500 milliamp 4S, which is primarily what I run for acrobatics, and I do not go bigger. Like I kind of strictly limit my battery weight to about 185, 188, under 190 grams is my target weight for my battery. And the 6S batteries are actually, 6S 1000 batteries are actually lighter than my 4S 1500 milliamp packs. But it's also easier for me to pull amps out of the battery. Like, the motors have the volts and they can spin up to speed and they suck more and more power. Whereas in a 4-cell pack, you drop volts as you suck more and more power. And so the motors don't have the ability to keep sucking the amps because the battery can't sustain the voltage. So it's easier to puff your packs on a 6-cell pack that's too small for your quad. And that's why the primary racing 6S pack has become about the 1250 milliamp pack, because it's equivalent to like a 1900 milliamp 4S pack. So I'm not sold at all on 6S for acro. And yep, that's that. Please don't forget to floss your teeth. I took out a lot of teeth today. Please don't forget to floss. Thank you. Goodbye.